The nice thing is we're recording this event. And so as a result, people will be able to watch this event and come to later events that follow up. So that's a great advantage. We're hoping also this goes beyond just being a live event for us at Researchers in VR. This is an event that once recorded, we'll have all 4 seminars recorded, and then we have this resource that we can direct people to. So it plays its role in that sense to a large degree. Okay, so what are we here to talk about? So today is part 1 of VR Researchers 101. How do we choose a research design? So Rel pointed out that I forgot to put my branding slide up at the beginning. So of course, this is a Researchers in VR event, which is under the umbrella, of course, of Educators in VR. So our broader community of which we are happily part. And so what the goal of this series is simply is to help people work through research, get a sense of if they're interested in the idea of doing research, how do you manifest that into actually doing research? How do you go from being a potential researcher to an actual researcher? And in talking to a lot of people in this community, one of the things that I found is that a lot of people just don't know how to wrap their head around getting started. It just seems like too big a thing, and they don't know what to think about, and they don't know what to consider and what decisions to make. And so the goal of this whole seminar series is to take everyone down that road a little bit, help everyone understand the choices they can make and what choices they have to make if they want to do research. So that's really the objective here. So moving ahead, I'm just going to talk just so you have some idea of who I am and why I would be teaching something like this. So a couple quick things. I teach a university course called Psych 4408, The Digital Revolution, and it is being taught at Mount Royal University where I teach. And so I teach that entirely here in Altspace, sort of like in the format we're in now, with people coming in, and we have live classes that way. I also am involved in virtual reality nature therapy. So this is my personal research area. So the goal of this research is sort of what it says right on the screen. Can nature scenes in VR be used to lower stress like real nature does? So the research shows that real nature lowers stress levels. So we've been doing a series of experiments, mostly in the lab, exposing people to different nature scenes in virtual reality and looking at the effects on stress reduction and also presence in virtual reality. So that's kind of my research area. What background do I have for teaching this in particular, research methods? Well, at my university, we have a course called Psych 2213. It is the required research design course for every psychology major in our program. So everybody has to take it, hundreds and hundreds of students. And this research methods course, I have taught it about 45 times is the best guess I can come up with over the last 20 years. So quite a lot, 2 or 3 times per year for decades. I've been teaching research design at a university level. So I'm pretty comfortable with the basic content, needless to say. I also teach our senior level course, which is 4413, our senior undergraduate level course, which is the special research class that all honors students who are going to take their honors thesis, they have to take that. And in more general, I have about 30 years of experience doing academic research at universities. And for the last 5 years, my research has all been in virtual reality. So I've been doing VR research for about 5 years. Okay, so that's my basic background of who I am. Briefly today, what I want to do is I'm going to go over a presentation. There's going to be a presentation here up on stage. And here the goal is to teach you guys some of the fundamentals. To be honest with you, a lot of this is straight out of my research methods class. Some of it's even straight out of day 1 on the research methods class. It's just the stuff that helps you understand about research designs and about what ones are out there and what decisions you might need to make regarding those research designs. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the types of research. We're going to talk about considerations that affect your choice as well. And then after that, we're going to move away from the stage and around the back. I have set up some research scenario group discussions. And so we're going to go around there and we're just going to talk about those scenarios and try and apply the principles that I'm sort of sharing with you in the presentation, and we'll try to incorporate those and apply those in the discussion part. So that's the goal and that's the plan for today. So I hope that will be useful for everyone and help people with their research moving forward. Okay, so the first thing I want to really talk about here is just sort of giving you guys an overview of like research in a really broad sense. I mean, research is a very vague word, to be honest with you. It means different things to different people, and research has so many different types. There's so many different things you could do in research. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to go through the massive list of everything you could do in research, but I'm going to highlight the most common strategies. Most of them will be things you're familiar with. So here, if we start at the top and we say research, I often describe to my students we can broadly separate research into a couple of categories. The first is quantitative versus qualitative research. And most of you are familiar with the word quantity, quantitative, so numbers, right? So quantitative research, just think of it as like whenever we're collecting a whole bunch of numbers. So if we're measuring something on a scale or we're measuring something visually, however we do it, we're turning our information that we're gathering into numbers. And then usually we do something with those numbers afterwards, which is like statistical analysis to draw conclusions. So we take those numbers, we analyze them, and from those, we draw conclusions about our research. We try to answer our research question. So quantitative research always involves turning your observations into numbers in some way. You can probably then imagine qualitative research is mostly focused on the quality of the experience. So not necessarily measuring things in the form of numbers, but more like if let's say Evelyn back there, her and I have a conversation and I'm asking her questions and she's a participant in my study and I want to get information from her, maybe I simply just have a conversation with her and record it, and then I describe the experience of that conversation, the main themes. Maybe I have that conversation with 20 people and I analyze all 20 and I look for what themes were in there. Was there a main point? Was there common things that people talked about all the time on this topic, whatever the topic was? So we can do that kind of analysis where we're not necessarily dealing with numbers and hard analysis of like big statistics, but we can do lots of other analyses as well. These other types of more verbal and language-based analyses. Okay. Typically, quantitative research lends itself to things like experiments and data collection. That's probably what most of you associate with that. And qualitative research, probably the one that most people are familiar with would be something like focus groups. And in a more classical sense, we talk about the concept of ethnography. This is all the way moving to like anthropology, where we might study a culture. But if you think about it, let's say you wanted to study the culture of people in VR, well, then you actually have to start adapting and borrowing techniques from places like anthropology, right? And ethnography. Here's a community, we want to study a community. So we can pull techniques from psychology, from computing science, from anthropology, from all kinds of different behavioral science disciplines. I just put this at the bottom, just so you guys can understand this. It doesn't always have to be one or the other. So real world complex research studies often involve components of this. I might run an experiment first, and from that experiment, I might get some information. And based on the information from my experiment, I might now be more informed to run a focus group or an ethnography. And then I might be able to run that better because I did an experiment first and I learned something from the experiment. Or vice versa, I might run focus groups, and based on what I learned from the focus groups, I'm able to figure out what variables I'm interested in, and I might run an experiment based on those. So anytime you sort of combine into a broader research program multiple types of research designs, we generally call that mixed methods, when you're combining qualitative and quantitative designs into one study. Now, for people who are starting off, probably jumping down the road of mixed methods is going way too far too quick. Start with something simple. That's a huge piece of advice. One of the things I see with research is people have a tendency to try and do too much with their very first research project. I'm going to figure out this and that and everything else, and I'm going to do, before you know it, you got this big complicated morass of stuff that you don't know how to get through and you don't know how to sort out and you don't know how to design and plan and organize. Keep it really simple at first and then add to it. You can start with something really simple and then add more complicated components to it as you go. Okay, so let's talk about some of these most common research designs that are used in a lot of research across a wide range of disciplines. So the first one, most straightforward, is running an experiment, an actual scientific experiment. So most of you probably remember, like, you know, junior high or high school, and they taught you the scientific method, and you applied that scientific method, probably mostly in chemistry classes or physics classes or some other science class. But it turns out science research, in terms of doing experiments in fields like psychology, applies the same principles. So we're trying to apply the exact same principles of quality scientific research, reliable and valid results. We don't need to worry about all the details of all of that terminology right now. But the concept is that you're trying to take the principle of doing a science experiment and all the principles that go along with good science, and you're trying to apply it to people. Now, the tricky thing with people, of course, is applying a scientific method to carbon atoms is a lot easier because one carbon atom tends to act almost exactly like the next carbon atom. But we know that that's not true with people. And so research with people has a tendency to be a little bit more complicated. Now, most of you here, probably many of you want to do research with people, but some of you might not. You might want to do research with technology, and you might be interested in advances in the technology. But even then, it often becomes people research because you ask people if they like the new technology. So it can be, each research scenario is unique. And so the idea here is to learn more generalized principles that you can apply to your specific scenario. That's what we're trying to achieve here. Okay, so let's look at these experiments. What are they good for? Right off the top, what's the best thing that an experiment is good for? Well, it's good for comparing different situations because you tend to manipulate the situation to create different conditions. So experiments are very good for answering these kinds of questions. Which sells more, packaging A or B? So you work for a marketing company and you've got blue packaging and you've got red packaging, the exact same product, and you're going to market it either in the blue packaging and the red packaging. You want to know which one sells the best. That type of question can lend itself well to an experiment. The only way that works, though, is you have to be able to, this is the trick to an experiment, you have to be able to hold everything else the same. So what I mean by that is if I'm going to sell my product in a store with a red label or a blue label, I think I went red and blue the other way, red and blue either way, I want to keep everything else the same. I don't want to put a red label in a store in Calgary. So all the stores in Calgary have the red label and all the stores in Edmonton have the blue label. If the red label outsells the blue label, I might conclude that the red label is better for marketing. I have a problem in that situation. The red label was only in Calgary and the blue label was only in Edmonton. Maybe people in Calgary are a little bit different than the people in Edmonton. So they like blue in Calgary. I can't remember which one I said was red and blue in which city anymore, but they might like the one that was sold in Calgary. The Edmontonians might like the other one. And if you switched them, you wouldn't get the same effect. So the problem is with an experiment, you need to keep everything the same. So you need to sell your product in Calgary in these exact stores at this time of day in these exact conditions. And then you need to sell the other product version in those exact same conditions. Then you know if one outsells the other, then it's that packaging that caused the thing to sell more than the other one because everything else was kept the same. It can't be caused by something else. It can only be caused by the packaging. That's if you run a perfect experiment. So right off the top, things I want to tell you about experiments are great for these kinds of questions where you have different conditions and you want to compare them. But they also require a lot more technical control. So if you're thinking about designing research and you think, oh, an experiment would be really cool, you have to start really thinking through, are you able to control all the other variables? Are you able to make the experience only different based on the one thing you want to change or manipulate? And that would be, in this case, the product packaging or whatever it is you're interested in. If you can't hold all the other things constant, then an experiment isn't the right research design. You want to try something else. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's the gist of it. Another thing I just want to point out here, you can have the same people in both conditions or different people, and we use this language within subjects or between subjects designs. So all I want you to understand there is when you're thinking about putting these together, if you are thinking you might want to do an experiment, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, can the same people do the different parts of the experiment? Like, let's say I have people exposed to a treatment for depression. So whatever that treatment is, and I've got treatment A and I've got treatment B. The question is, can I have the same people in treatment A and treatment B? Does it have to be the same people? It turns out it can be either. And it depends on what you're doing research on. So less people is good. Using the same people more than once is good from the point of view of you don't have to find as many people or pay as many people or whatever the situation is. It's a lot more effective. You can imagine if I have 2 treatments for depression and I take all my people over here and I treat them with treatment number 1 and they get better, how do I then use the same group to test treatment number 2? they're already biased by treatment number one. So in that kind of scenario, you usually want to use different groups so you can compare that group to this group. But there are other times where it doesn't matter if they do both. You can have half do this one and that one, half do the first condition and the second condition. So it just depends on your particular situation, whether it feels like it's going to be a problem if you have if you have all your participants do all the different conditions. Because one condition might change their answers in the other condition, and that invalidates your experiment. So experiments are tricky. There's a lot of details you have to work through to do an experiment. Next one I want to talk about, surveys are very common. So they're excellent for measuring opinions and attitudes. So that's mostly what you're thinking about here in surveys. If you want to know people's opinions and attitudes, if you want to ask them about the behaviors, surveys are excellent for this, right? So surveys, you might have a scenario where they're typically presented in the form of statements, so you can agree or disagree on a 5-point scale. How many of you had a survey like this before, where you filled out a survey and it's like these scales, you can strongly agree or strongly disagree. It's usually a neutral in the middle, or you can sort of agree, right? Some of you recognizing that. Most of you are familiar with that type of a question. It's actually called a Likert scale question, or Likert actually was the name of the guy, how he pronounced it. But these types of questions are really, really useful. They're quantitative in that we're adding a number. We're giving an answer on a number scale. I'll give a 4 to that or a 5 to that. So they are quantitative typically in how they're used. And they're nice because they're very flexible. They're very easy to deliver. So you don't even necessarily need to be there. You can deliver surveys through VR. You can deliver surveys through the internet. SurveyMonkey and online companies like that will help you do it. So surveys are much easier to get out. The question becomes things like, do you have access to the participants? If you're going to email out a survey, who are you emailing it to, and where are you getting those email addresses from? So there's issues around implementation with regards to surveys. So you have to, again, look at your situation. Do you have your people right around you? Can you do it in person? Is it something that's remote? You have to ask yourself, will a survey answer my research question? Will it help me? So we might have a survey on COVID-19 attitudes, 20 questions about your support for COVID-19 restrictions and your personal COVID-19 behaviors. The one thing I want you to take note of here is usually, well, I shouldn't say usually, often surveys are divided into a couple styles of questions. So the first is attitudes and the other is behaviors. So I might ask you, what's your opinion about? How do you feel about? Any question like that is asking you about your attitude, isn't it? If you think about it, I'm asking you about what your opinion is. How do you feel about it? Right? That's really different than asking you, when you're here, do you do this behavior? Or do you do that behavior? Did you buy this thing? And I'm asking you about behaviors. And so often with surveys, we want to know about attitudes and we want to know about behaviors, because we want to know if, say, a person buys the product, but we also might want to know what their attitude was before they started it, their attitude towards the product that made them want to buy it, for example. So this can work over a wide range of scenarios. And we can also do something like a pre-test, post-test design, which I just put down here. It doesn't have to be this way. This is just an example. I might use a survey or a tool like that to measure someone's behaviors and attitudes about something. Then I might give them some kind of VR exposure, like put them in a VR world or have them experience something in VR or go to an event in VR. And then I might retest them to see if the scores from here changed after the virtual reality exposure. So you measure something, you expose them to something, and you see if that changes their performance or their behavior or their attitudes or whatever it is you're interested in. So that's another way that you can use a survey tool to do something like that. Next, ethnographies. So ethnography is more of the anthropological style, as I was saying. So this is actually from the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Anthropology. This is their definition of what an ethnography is. The recording and analysis of culture or society, usually based on a participant observation and resulting in a written account of people, place, or institution. So things to take note of there. This is when we're interested more in a culture, in a whole group, the collective opinion of that group or their collective understanding, or how they see that technology, in this case something like VR, impacting their culture and their society. This is more lends itself to something like an ethnography. In this case, you'll observe people and describe their behavior in one form or another. So you can record them, you can document them yourselves, you might use video recordings. There's all different ways you can document and observe what you're doing. These are often interviews. So sometimes scientists talk about being super objective and standing back, and they don't want to influence the performance of the participants in the experimental study, and it's all very controlled. Ethnography is completely different. Ethnography, you jump right in. You jump into the group. Some ethnographers even join the group that they're studying. They become a member of that group so that they can better understand the cultural implications and the societal implications and things like that. So it's not as objective. You can't draw the same kind of conclusions, but you can get right into a culture or right into a group of people. And it's usually direct interviews, asking them and then comparing all the different interviews and the types of answers that people gave. And you're usually looking for themes. What general concepts did people generally talk about when I asked them these questions, sort of a thing. That's an ethnography. It's good for, again, that sort of broader cultural approach. And I did double. Focus groups. Last major one I want to talk about is focus groups. So focus group, I actually took this straight off SurveyMonkey's website because I thought that was funny. But anyway, a focus group it's actually a pretty accurate description of a focus group. So focus group is a small gathering of people in an interactive setting, generally a room or an online video conference, where they discuss a specific subject under the guidance of a trained moderator. So this is a small group interview. You're literally just going to interview these people, talk to them, ask them. Usually you let them have a conversation. The trick to a good focus group is the moderator. The moderator is everything in a good focus group. The moderator can't give their opinion because it will bias the opinions of the other people. The moderator has to know how to keep the conversation moving forward and on topic through a sequence of questions. Usually the moderator will have, say, 5 or 6 questions they're going to ask the group to discuss. And then you don't really want to play a role in that conversation. You want to sit back as the moderator and observe their conversation. You're kind of leading it, but you don't want to be in it too much. Should clarify though, that can change. If you're leaning down more that ethnography, you're doing a focus group for an ethnography, you might change your questions as you go based on the conversation that they're having. You might have had a plan for it to go in one direction and it might go in a different one. So it just depends on the style of your research and what it is you're trying to achieve in your research. Okay, so where are we here? Okay. So we can start to pull all of that together. So specific design considerations, some things related to VR, that if you're doing VR research, these are other things you also need to start considering. Are you observing your participants during, before, or after the VR experience? Like, is it something like where somebody is out of VR and fills in some questionnaires, puts VR on, has an experience, takes the headset off, and then fills out more questionnaires, like that pre-test, post-test? Or is it something like where you're coming into a place like this, and I'm going to observe you as your avatar here in VR? That's a very different type of setup. So you have to think that through. What is it actually? What's the research situation going to actually work, feel like? How is it going to work? Are your participants filling out questionnaires before, during, after VR experience? Do you need all participants to have the same experience, or do you need different VR experiences? So this is sort of what I was talking about before with the different groups. And where will these VR experiences come from? Obviously, one of the challenges with VR research is creating the virtual reality experiences that you want people to have for your research. So you have to ask, are you developing those? Do you have the technological ability to develop those, or the time? Do you know somebody else who can do it? Do you have money to pay somebody else to do it? So those might be other considerations that are relevant. A couple other final points that I want to tie this all together with. So those are your basic, most common research designs, and you're going to decide sort of amongst those which one sort of fits the best. That's kind of how this is going to work. So let's talk about fit. How do we make that fit decision? Population and sample. So this is about the people. So one of the things that's critical is understanding at the end of your research, you're going to want to be able to say something like, people are more likely to buy the product in the red packaging than the blue packaging. So who are these people you're talking about? Like this general conclusion. You might say, well, if you did the research in Edmonton and Calgary, maybe what you want to do in my area is say, all the people in my province, or the people in Canada, for example, are blah, 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 whatever the conclusion of your research is. So we talk about that as being the population. That's all the people you'd like to be able to generalize your finding to, right? All the people it should describe. And then the sample is the actual group of people that you got to use in your research study. Okay, so that's the small subset of people. That makes sense for everyone? Nod your heads up and down. Give me emojis. You can always do that. Thank you. So when we deal with those people, we have our sample. When we're getting our sample from our population, in a pure sense, we could random sample. And that means, like in this pure sense, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected in the sample. That's something you hear in science all the time, but in practice, it's not very realistic. If I want to get a sample from the people of the city I live in, somehow I would have to have a giant list of every person that, all 1.2 million people that live in the city I live in. I'm not going to be able to get a true random sample. So what we end up doing sometimes is a combination of sampling that's random and convenient sampling. So sampling whoever's available and around and is willing to do it. That, to be honest with you, is what happens more often. And the reality is it doesn't actually matter as long as this principle is held to. The sample has to represent the population. And I'll say this in a big exaggerated sort of example, but let's say I want to understand the attitudes of middle-aged housewives in Iowa, whatever group that would even represent in today's world, I don't know, but I'm just making something up. If I use university undergrads at my university to test, I'm probably not going to learn a lot about middle-aged housewives in Iowa, am I? Because my sample doesn't represent my population. The sample isn't similar to the people I want to generalize the results to. So however you get your sample, you want to be thinking about whether your sample represents the population you want to generalize out to. It's a very critical point. If it doesn't matter how good your science is, because you can't draw any conclusions and apply them to a group of people because your sample didn't represent that group of people. So it's a really critical idea. And when you're thinking about who's available to do your research, don't forget it. The one other critical principle I want to share with you then is this other one, which is correlation is not causation. And this is another age-old principle that we talk about in research. It basically means this idea that just because two things happen at the same time doesn't necessarily mean one of them causes the other to happen. So sometimes when you're doing research, you want to know what behavior someone might engage in. And sometimes that's good enough. We want predictability. I know when someone's going to engage in that behavior. I know that if this condition and this condition and this condition exist, that predicts that this person will engage in that behavior or say that thing or do that thing or whatever. That's predictability. Cause is something much more difficult. Cause means that you actually know that these exact things cause that behavior. So let me give you an example, a quick example. Smoking causes cancer. This is an age-old statement and a debate. It was for years and everything else. Why was this a debate? Why wasn't this easy to do? Because if you think about to run the pure experiment that would prove that smoking causes cancer, I can't do it. It's unethical. I would need to take, right, because I said, if you want to do an experiment, you have to control all the other conditions. They all have to be the same, other than, in this case, smoking would be the one thing. So the perfect version of this experiment, I get 10,000 people. 5,000 people, I tell them so 10,000 people who don't smoke. 5,000 people, I tell them for the next 10 years, you're not allowed to smoke, ever. And we're going to track and see if you get cancer. For the other 5,000 people, I say, you have to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes every day for the next 10 years, and we're going to see if you die. Most of you can probably understand there's an ethical problem with that research study, right? That's not something you can really do. So what you end up doing is these versions of what looks like an experiment, but actually isn't. So you take 5,000 people who already smoke, and you compare them to 5,000 people who don't smoke, and you see who gets cancer. But maybe it turns out that the reason, so let's say you find out that smokers get cancer more than the non-smokers, but you don't actually know that it's the smoking that caused it because they were smokers before you even met them. Maybe it turns out all the people who choose to smoke have some other condition wrong with their brain that causes them to get cancer. You don't know. So the problem with most of these research studies is you can't extract cause unless you run a really controlled experiment, and that's really hard to do. So for most people, survey research and those styles will help. with that because you don't have to be so controlled. And just to show you a funny example from the textbook I used for my course, this is to show that correlation, two things can be highly correlated, meaning one can predict the other without one causing the other. So on this side, this is the number of films Nicolas Cage, the actor, made between 1999 and 2009. And on this side shows the graph showing the swimming pool drownings from 80 to 140. So how many people drowned in swimming pools by falling in the United States that given year? And it turns out they're highly correlated. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. It turns out that knowing how many movies Nicolas Cage was in is an excellent predictor for knowing how many people drowned in a pool that year. As weird as that is. Would any of us say that, well, Nicolas Cage maybe isn't the greatest actor, so maybe, when he makes lots of movies, people want to kill themselves and fall in a pool? I don't know, but more than likely, these two are not actually causally related to each other. They just randomly happen to have correlated with each other. So that's an important principle, understanding what kind of conclusion you can draw. These two things might both happen at the same time, and you might find in your research that they're happening at the same time, but it doesn't mean one necessarily causes the other. So it's an important understanding. So I'm going to finish off with this by just showing you the cardinal rule. So the cardinal rule of any research design then is this: let your research design decisions be guided by your research question. Figure out what it is you really want to know first. So step one, clearly define your research question. What do you really want to know? This is the most important step. Because if you start diving into research without knowing exactly what it is you want to find out, then you can't make any design decisions, because the design decisions should all be, which choice will help me answer my research question the best? That should be the guiding principle of which design you choose. So step one, clearly define your research question. Take time, think this through. Step two, look at the various possible designs and which one fits your research question. And then on a more practical level, when you're considering which one fits your research question, who will your participants be? What access do you have to them? What resources will the researchers take? What resources will the research take? VR headsets, money, time. What resources do you actually have access to? Because we can design all the most beautiful theoretical studies we want, but if we can't actually implement them with the real tools and resources we have, then they're just ideas, not research. And where and when will the research take place? You know what's funny is I realized after I put this slide together, I almost hit on all of the principles of journalism. Rel would know this. This is more your field, right? I think. Who, what, when, where, and why. Wasn't that the old saying that that's what you had to know to write an article about anything for journalism? You needed to explain who, what, when, where, and why was going on. And if you think about it, we kind of have them. Who, what resources, where will it happen, when will it happen, and the why, that was your research question in the first place, right? That's the research question, the why. So these basic principles all apply. Okay, so that is my formal lecture-y type presentation up here. I know that's a lot of words and a lot of talking, but there's a lot of these principles I wanted to share with you. So the idea really, again, the take home, think about your research question, figure out what research question you want to ask, then start looking at these different designs and say, well, if I did a survey, what would that look like? What questions would I ask? How would I implement it? Would that work? Oh, no, maybe I want to do a focus group. What would that look like? How would that implement? You know, like, what would I do? Where would I get the people from? Do I have people I could have in it? Do I have, you know, someone who could be the moderator? Would I be the moderator? You know, like all of those types of things. Just sit down and try to envision it. You almost have to imagine what that research would look like when you pick a particular design and apply it to your research question. And so then you sort of narrow it down, and then you go to the next steps, which is figuring out all the actual procedures and getting all the documents that you need, or all the other bits and pieces. And guess what? That's next week's class, or next month's class. So seminar 2, we'll start to dive into that next one. As if you started to kind of think you have some idea about which research design you want, what do you do next? How do you then implement that actual design? How do you get all the pieces of the puzzle together as stuck together? Okay, so for the last part of today, what I want to do is I'm going to leave the stage here. We're going to jump off the stage, and we're just going to follow. I'll just turn off this stage blockers, and if you follow me, I want everyone to follow me around the corner here. So I will go over here. Everybody can see me over here. I'm waving. Everybody's with me. Come on over. Join me. And we're going to work our way down here. This is what you said, Rel, about losing people with. Come on down. We're just going around the front over here, everyone. Just to the back behind the stage. And over here where it says scenario 1, where I'd like you to join me. Come on down, Al. Okay, so scenario 1. I work for a marketing company. Our client wants to know if their customers like the new version of their VR game. Specifically, the client wants to know what features are most liked and which are least liked. What research design could I use? So I want you guys to provide feedback. We don't need to do anything formal here. We can just stand and have a chat. So feel free, open your mics. What do you guys think? What might work with this? There's lots of different designs. That's why I put the S after design. It's not like there's one right answer here. You could do an experiment. You could do a survey. You could do a focus group. All of these things are possible. Anybody have any suggestions? What would a survey for this look like? Who would be in that survey? Let's start. Okay, so let's start with, nobody seems to want to jump in. Let's start with the research question. What do you think the research question would be? What does this person really want to know? I mean, the first thing you have to do...
Likability of the VR game?
Right, so likability of the VR game. And then it said specifically what features are liked most and least. But what you'd really need to do as a researcher is start defining that terminology. So the first thing I would do is I'd go, okay, what counts as a feature? What does my client really want to know? They said features, but what does that mean? What specifically do they want to know? And then liked and disliked. So we need 2 categories of features. Things that they think people like, things that they think they don't like. But I also want the people giving the response to have an open-ended kind of question too, where they can say, I really didn't like this. And maybe the people who made the game never even thought of that as an idea, that somebody wouldn't like this. So there has to be an open way for people to give responses, to give their answers. So I might almost need survey questions. And then, sometimes you get to a survey and at the bottom it says, is there something else you'd like us to know? And there's an open area and you can fill in. So you can add what's called open-ended questions to a survey. So that might be one way to do it. I mean, you could definitely do this as an experiment. So you could set this up where you had, the experiment would be really tricky. You'd need different versions of the game that had different errors built into it, and you could see if people reacted. So for an active video game, probably an experiment maybe isn't the best. What about a focus group? Would you do a focus group with this? What do you guys think? Yeah, a few people sort of responding to that.
So.
Yeah. Just if you want to talk, just jump right in.
Can I talk?
Oh. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Anybody jump right in.
Oh, I just play a game. The name is Elven Assassin.
Yeah.
And
familiar with it?
That game, it's about archery and killing orcs. And there's a group in Facebook that is not the official one, and there's a lot of information of what the users want in the new updates. I think that's a good way to know.
So what Cornelius is describing, everybody, is what we call, haven't really talked about it here, it's called archival research. So here, sometimes the data is already out there. You don't have to go get new data. You're talking about a situation where there's a whole bunch of people on Facebook posting up a lot of information already. They're already talking about it. So maybe you already have your interviews. They're just talking to each other. Now the question was, how would you get access to that information to use it for research? You need to get permission in some way to use that research. So that will be the next step. But yeah, you can definitely just dive into existing sources of data that are out there. That's another option. Here, before we have to run out today, let's switch over to...
The focus group, you can use like the kind of people that is in that group to
absolutely
start the survey. Yeah. I don't know.
So again, good question. So what people could you use in a focus group? Could you use those kind of people that are on the Facebook group? Absolutely. But they would give you certain types of answers, right? So people who are really experienced with the game are going to give you a certain type of answer, probably more specific. Their concerns about features are going to be more detailed. But you might also want to get people play the game for the very first time and give you their opinion about it. that will give you a different type of information. So again, it just depends on what your research question is, which people to put in your focus group depend on what your research question is. And in fact, maybe you run multiple focus groups, some with new people and some with experienced people. Again, depends on what it is you want to know. So these are all great ideas. I just want to move quickly to scenario number 2. So if we just all turn around over here, got another one just here. So this one we can think of as, I'm an academic researcher. I want to know what memory strategy will be most effective when learning from a textbook. I have 2 different memory strategies I can teach, but I want to know which one will be the best. So I'm a professor, and part of my course, I'm going to teach these students some kind of memory strategy so they can be more effective on their textbook. But this is important. So now I'm going to do some research on it, and I want to know which strategy will be the most effective. So what does this lend itself to? What do you guys think? Do you think surveys or experiments, or is there something that jumps out at you?
Focus group.
Yeah, Alf. Focus group, sure. So explain that to us. Share it with us.
Well, I think if you get a group of people together, you can have an open discussion. You could ask specific questions and get answers from different people during that one session. And hopefully at the end of it, you have enough feedback to give you a method to use.
Excellent. So in Alf's scenario, he says about taking people in a focus group and getting them to give you just feedback about their experiences with using these techniques. So the idea there, though, is that the assumption built into that is that you've given all the people the opportunity to practice or learn these techniques, or they're something they already know. So you might have to design a scenario where first you teach them the 2 techniques, you let them practice the 2 techniques, and then you have a focus group to get their feedback about the 2 techniques. Right? So you might design something like that. Alternatively, you could design an experiment around something like this. So I could take 50 people and I could teach them one technique, and I could take 50 people and I could teach them the other. I could teach them the same content, just using a different technique, and I could give them the exact same test and find out which group performs better than the other group. So that would be the way of taking this idea and putting it in an experiment. Again, that requires a lot more control, a lot of situations, and experiments are a little more technically detailed, but you could certainly do that. You could also see, you could, let's say, I can see another scenario, or let's say I could find a community of people that exist in somewhere out there in the world. I'm sure this isn't that hard to find, but a community of people who are experts and interested in memory strategies, and they take a lot of time to learn them and use them. There are groups of people who are into these kind of memory tasks, right? And they enjoy it. I could find a group like that, so a group of memory experts, and I could do a survey with them, right? I could ask them to talk about these different memory techniques and answer questions about whether they like them, what they don't like about them, what they find easy to learn, hard to learn, and so forth. So I could do something like that. So this is the take home, guys, is this is why I put an S at the end. You can see that in any sort of initial scenario, there's a lot of options. And you make the decision about the options by simply going back to your research question. Of all these different scenarios we talked about that you can kind of envision, you say, this is what I want to do research in. You envision all these different scenarios, an experiment, a survey, a focus group, or whatever, archival research. And then you really just kind of sit back and go, when I really think about it, it's either going to be a survey or a thing, because these other ones have problems. And then if I'm going to choose those, this is going to look like this, and this is going to look like this. Survey is going to have these pros and these cons, and whatever focus group is going to have these pros and these cons, and eventually you just kind of lay them out and you make a decision. And then once you have basically a decision about your research design, as I said, then we can move on to the other stuff we'll be talking about in the future seminars coming up. Okay. So the next seminars is we're going to take the concepts from here and we're going to say, how do we turn these into a set of procedures that we can actually execute, like a set of steps, almost like script that you write for people to say, and equipment and forms and like all of the bits and pieces that you have to organize to get your research running. So that's where we'll be going next with this seminar series. So it is 12:51. We have just a few more minutes left. So I want to actually go up here, up on where this fire is on the platform to my right, your left, and there's another scenario number 3 up there. So let's take a look at that one really. So up here on the platform.
Is there going to be time for questions? Because we're running out
Yeah.
of time.
Yep, this is the last one I'm going to do.
Because you have 8 minutes.
8 minutes. It's an eternity.
Yeah.
So scenario 3, I'm curious about the effect of social VR platforms could have on self-esteem during the COVID-19 pandemic. More specifically, I have a hypothesis. Social VR platforms have an overall positive effect on mental health. Anybody want to take a stab at a design that you could apply to that? A little more vague, this one, isn't it? It's weird because I have a hypothesis, which lends itself kind of hypothesis testing is sort of associated with experiments. I don't necessarily need to do an experiment just because I have a prediction, right? Just because I predict something doesn't mean I have to do an experiment. I might be able to go to, so again, I'm gonna have to start thinking about people. I'm curious about the effect of social VR platforms. Okay, what's a social VR platform? Well, we're in one. And who uses them? Who would be these people? How would I get contact with them? How would I engage with that community? More specifically, I have a hypothesis that says it'll be positive. So again, we would want a survey would actually lend itself very well here. We could ask a survey about their interaction, social VR, and what they think their opinion is about how it's affecting their mood or behavior. So a survey might lend itself very well to this kind of question. Okay, so that is the sort of presentation. There's one more scenario down there. You guys are welcome to that later afterwards in a few more minutes if you just want to think about it yourself. I just want to open it up if anybody's got any questions at this point. I'll use the, should I use the raise hand? Let's use the raise hand. So a new little button just popped up to your lower right. If you would like to ask a question of the group, you are welcome to do so. Feel free to just click on that and you can ask a question. First up is Rel.
Hi. Thank
Hi.
you. This is amazing. I'd like to know when in using social VR as one of the research tools, what are the limitations for observation?
Are you talking about ethically or?
No, I'm talking about in VR, you can't monitor sign language. I mean, sign language.
Right.
First impressions and facial cues and body language and anything along that line. That's not available. You can do hand gestures and things, but how
Right.
does that change the
Well, I think,
observation aspect?
yeah, it's a good question, Rel, because often in psychological research and sociological research, we are often looking at very detailed behaviors when you're observing someone. But you can only observe what's available to be observed. So you have to ask yourself the question, like, let's say you want to do a type of research that involves observation, like right here in Altspace. I'm going to observe a community here in Altspace at an event and try and learn something about that community. I can only observe the behaviors that are visible. The thing about behavioral observation is you can't go into someone's head. You can only observe what they actually do. And from that, you interpret what you think they might be thinking or what their attitude is. Even when someone says, even when you ask a question on a survey about your attitude is what, and they give you an answer about their attitude, that's actually not their attitude that you're observing. It's their behavior. They're writing about their attitude. You're observing their behavior. But you can only observe the behavior that's around you. So you have to ask yourself, okay, so here's what I would be able to observe in Altspace. I can watch someone move, I can move hands, sort of like what you were talking about, Ralph. And then you have to ask yourself, from that, do I think I can extract enough information to answer my research? If I can't, and you might need a different research question, right? Or you might need a different method to answer that research question. So you simply have to, again, it's just letting the research question drive the research. You might want to understand something about behavior and subtle motion here and activity here in Altspace VR. But if that isn't available to observe, then that's not a viable research project at the moment. So you might have to wait, or you might have to do a different research question.
Thank you. My other question was, what I know your the backstory. You've put a lot of work into this particular world to use it for teaching and presenting and things. But have you found limitations or things that makes the virtual environment influence or to take into consideration when choosing for research?
Yeah.
I think that would be huge. So I know it's a big question, but I was just meant in general.
Yeah, it is. It is in the sense of like, a lot of it is practical limitations right now. I mean, again, when we talk research, everyone always likes to talk theoretical, right? Like, I want to do these wonderful things. But the reality is the things that influence the decision of research design usually tend to be really practical. So I was talking about a moment ago, I was talking about a practical thing, which is the fact that VR only has this limitation right now. There's other ones like right now I'm trying to design a research project where I want people to fill out some questionnaires, but I'd love that research project to be completely automated where I don't even have to be there. So I'm trying to figure out, can I have people come in here into a space like this and open, say, a Google form effectively, fill it out effectively, and then move on, and then have some VR experience, and then maybe answer other questionnaires. So the design is in part being driven by whether I can technologically get that to work properly, right, in an effective way. And if not, then I have to change what the goal of the research is, or I have to find a different way to implement. So, so yeah, I would say VR has some practical limitations in terms of things like what you can do in here, right? We've talked many times before about you can't write in here. That's a limitation. It's definitely a limitation, and it would influence the type of research you're going to do because you simply can't put a form in front of someone and ask them to fill it out that easily in here. So that's a practical limitation. There's also some social limitations as well, I think, in here in terms of. So remember we said the principle of a sample should represent the population. So you have to ask yourself, what's your population? Because the sample, if you're going to test people like us in here, we are not representative of the people in the larger like world in many ways. Probably the people in this room on average have higher socioeconomic status than the average person on this planet because you were able to buy or access a computer or VR headset to get in here. So that by definition puts you probably pretty high up in socioeconomic status. You probably live in more wealthy countries and well-off countries. So this defines the type of sample I can get from here. You have to understand, if you're going to sample people from within, say, Altspace, you have to think about how does that sample represent a population? What population would be represented by this sample? Because in this case, you can't change the sample to represent the population. You might say, well, I'm going to sample these people, so who can I generalize that result to? Can I generalize it to everyone in Altspace? Could I generalize it to everyone who puts on a VR headset? I don't know. It depends on what your research question is and what you're doing. So there's those kinds of limitations as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And I just want to say, because I don't see another question, hopefully other people will have questions. But Educators in VR in 1 hour will be on our Discord at discord.me/educatorsinvr. We are bringing back our podcast, our new podcast that we started on the Discord stage. We're going to be talking about interactivity and engagement in social VR for event hosting, for running classes, for, how do you engage with the students and how do you interact with them and control the atmosphere and the experience for maximum engagement with the team from the founding team from We Are Improv here in Altspace with Stevie and Dawn, who have multiple, they have years of experience of dealing with improv and events and all kinds of crazy wackadoodle stuff. And so they're going to be sharing their insights. So it'll be very, very appropriate for researchers to understand also how do you promote engagement. So that's coming up in an hour. So just little time to pitch and join our Discord anyway.
and I'll follow up with a little pitch as well. So just a reminder to everyone that this event was recorded today. So again, it will show up on the Educators in VR site. So please direct people to that. So that encourage people. If you thought this was useful, come back next month and to the second one, and encourage others to do so, to come and join us. You can direct them once the video is posted to that video, so they can quickly watch the video and then join us, and they're up to speed before they come to the second event. So I'd really appreciate it if you could encourage people to do that. I think that this will, in the long run, be a valuable tool for people. I hope so, anyway. Okay, so I just want to say thank you to everyone. Time is up. It's been wonderful, guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And again, you can get a hold of me through Altspace and through all these different communities through Discord. If you have any more specific questions, or if you're starting to design research and have some specific questions, you can find me and fire away. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye
What I
bye.
find interesting is that you're asking about self-esteem, and I never self-esteem. What I am really grateful for being here is that I think it's kind of been keeping me sane